Hello and welcome to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm Gabriel Sanders, the public programs producer at the museum, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our celebration of Jewish genealogy, heritage, and immigration, the Mishpachah Festival, and more specifically to the Bintel Brief, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, how one advice column changed and is still changing Jewish life in America with Chana Pollack and Beth Harpaz in partnership with The Forward, and thanks to the support from the Battery Park City Authority. The museum is going to close at 5 today after our programs, so we hope you'll explore our exhibitions on another visit. On view is The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do on the main level, and Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, photographs by Martin Scholler on the third floor. Andy Goldsworthy's Garden of Stones is also worth a visit just outside our wonderful Cafe Locks. You can pick up books in Judaica at the Pickman Museum Shop and visitor services on the main level. Also, keep an eye out for this fall's exhibition, opening of Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, our first exhibition for visitors 9 and up about the incredible story of the Danish rescue. Your support and membership are essential to our work, and we hope you will consider making a donation or joining if you are not already a member. If you are, you know the museum members enjoy exclusive programs, previews to exhibitions, and free admission to our galleries. Learn more about membership and our upcoming public programs on our website. Your feedback also helps our work. Please check your inbox for our festival follow-up email with a survey. We really appreciate it. I'd now like to ask everyone to silence your cell phones and anything else that might make noise. I'm now glad to introduce you to our speakers. Chana Pollack is the Forward's archivist, providing Yiddish research, translation, and production of original Forward archival content for the past 24 years. The Forward's archival photos and their related stories are presented publicly in an ongoing digital mapping app and web-based project with Urban Archive. Chana was a regular guest on the Forward's Bintel Brief podcast. In collaboration with the museum at Eldridge Street's curator Nancy Johnson, they created an exhibition of original halftone prints based on the Forward's archival photo press plates called Pressed Images from the Jewish Daily Forward that is currently on exhibition at the Hillman Library in Pittsburgh. Chana's 2021, the Forward personal essay, We're Here, We're Queer, We're Yiddish, LGBTQ Stories and Silences in the Forward's Archives, won a Rockower American Jewish Press Association Award for Excellence in North American Jewish History. Chana loves to find a Yiddish needle in the haystack and has expertise in reading Yiddish curlicue handwriting. Beth Harpaz is a lifelong New Yorker and longtime journalist who worked for the Associated Press, CUNY, the Bergen Record, and the Staten Island Advance before joining the Forward. She's also the author of 3 books, including The Girls in the Van, a reporter's diary of covering Hillary Clinton. She loves reading advice columns. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will now hand it off to Chana.
Thank you. Shalom Aleichem, Tayar Aleners. It's really nice to see everybody. Okay, I'm going to get going. From what you just heard, the Bintel is also available as a podcast hosted by Lynn Harris and Gina Green, and I got to appear there as the archivist bringing some of the older material, and that's what I'm going to do today before we jump over to my colleague that I'm so excited and honored to be co-speaking with. Beth is our current Eitzageber in Yiddish, we would say, our advice giver. She's editing the Bintel, and she's a writer. And if you've recently read the Elena Kagan bagel issue, that was all Beth. If anything happens and the Supreme Court gets a little more just, that's due to Beth. So I'm super excited to be here with her. Okay, just to jump right in, the Bintel Brief is the Forward's much-loved advice column. It was actually created in 1906, the brainchild of our founding editor, Abraham Kahn. Seeing the amount of mail that was arriving at the Forward's office, our historic building, of course, is on East Broadway. We're no longer there, but we've pretty much, for the run of our life, starting in 1897, we've pretty much been on East Broadway. So the amount of mail arriving at the office, combined with the fact that the offices were open 24/7, right? You could walk in anytime, caused mail and people seeking the Forward's guidance in creating their new lives in America to crowd their offices. So that's the short version of how the Bintel happened. Now for a little bit of the longer version. A Bintel Brief means literally a pile of letters, right? And it became the Forward's longest running feature. We're 126 years old, and it was started in 1906. And it ran without a break in Yiddish pretty much into the 80s. Then there was a little bit of break. We're back again. So it's been running for over a century. It's the longest running feature, publishing the Yiddish reading public's questions, comments, dilemmas, and problems. Under the editorship of Beth Harpaz now, and a podcast, like I said, we're still answering readers' questions. You can send them in. I think it's bintel@forward.com. And we're hoping you've brought your problems today. You have a little bit of time. Think it up. We've got the expert. I'm sure you... And just to give you a sense of what it was like in the Forward's offices as this developed. From our 29th anniversary edition of the paper in 1926, this is how they described when the Bintel got going, right? It started in 06, so by 26 it's been going for 2 decades. And this is how the writer described what it was like. Years ago, when a plane would take off, all of New York left their workstations to yank their heads skywards, observing the marvel. And it's the same with that sensation originally created by the Bintel Brief. So that's like the energy in the office around this. And this is from Abraham Kahn, our founding editor, novelist, socialist activist, founding editor of the paper all the way until he died in 51. From 1897, a little bit of a break, to 51. In his memoirs, he wrote about what it was like to try to come up with this. And it didn't just pop in 1906. They had 3 years where they tried to make this thing happen. They weren't so successful, and then by 1906 it actually happened. And this is how he writes about how it happened. In 1903, he wrote about, he began talking to Forward staff about how to create a living, talking newspaper. In Yiddish, he said, a lebendige Zeitung. Not merely should the articles be interesting to read, but they should mostly be derived from real-life events. He said, I'm reminded of the saying, das Leben ist chikaver wie ausgeklärte Meises. Life is more compelling than fiction, basically. He wrote, I wanted the Forwards to receive stories von dem Leben allein, from life itself. Dramas, comedies, curious events not made up at the writer's desk, but rather in the homes, factories, cafes, everywhere life plays out its own dramas. In 1903, we appealed to readers to send us interesting true stories. Lots came in, but many were of little interest. I was disappointed, he said. In 1904, again, they appealed to readers to send in interesting events. Mountains of letters started arriving, but out of those mountains, he's writing, only a few were chosen, and it was still difficult to choose. I ended up having to close that feature. Months went by, and in January 1906, his associate editor, Leon Gottlieb, himself, Forward's reporter, columnist, managing editor, playwright, novelist of over 40 novels, said 3 letters have arrived at our office that could make a great feature on their own. Each of them told about a personal issue. I thought about these 3 letters, Kahn says, and my response was, let's publish them and call it a Bintel Brief. And again, back to that 1926 anniversary edition, when they talked about what it was like as the Bintel started, how they perceived of it, they wrote, the Bintel Brief is an enchanted mirror, focusing all of life's yielding phenomenon down to one moment. There's an aura behind each letter that gets published. Episodes play out, enacted by marvelous oddball characters the reader doesn't see. And just to say, I think most people know, if you're not a Yiddish reader, you know about the Bintel Brief because Isaac Metzger, our last editor of the Bintel Brief, actually published 2 English volumes of them. But just to let you know that our back issues are digitized, they're available online, there's no paywall through the National Library of Israel, and there you can find like tens of thousands that haven't been translated yet. And I'm going to bring a couple of them in a minute. But I also wanted to say that, that's the legend of Abkan and how, Leon Gottlieb and how it was invented. But there were also, if you look at our paper, there were lots of predecessors, what I would say are kind of led up to the invention of this advice column. And one of them was called Briefkasten. Like I said before, the building was open 24/7. Anybody could come in, and you could also have your mail sent there. So it was like a post, what we say in Europe, post restant. So even before you came to America, you could have had, mail waiting for you. You could find out about a relative waiting for you. And the Forward would publish, this post box as a feature item with like 1 or 2 line notices. So-and-so, your uncle is looking for you. He's in Brooklyn. So-and-so, your mail is at the office. Come by. And more serious, here's where you can find some assistance for your legal problems. Things like that. So I think that's a little bit of a build-up. They always published what was called Schiffsnachrichten. It was like the schedule of the ship, shipping news, literally the shipping news, what ships were arriving that day. And then eventually, as people really kept sending in letters, they invented a column called Von Volk zum Volk. It became like letters to the editor, but it had mostly information about the socialist events going on, the lectures, what's going on in the labor movement, things like that. But still, they were encouraging the voice of the reader. In the 1920s, a lot of people don't know this, but the Forward started their first English edition. It ran for about a decade, close to a decade. And as part of it, they had an advice column called Ask Polly. And it was Polly Lerner. I haven't found a lot of historic information about this individual, but supposedly she was a social worker on the Lower East Side. At some point, we don't really know. A lot of people like to know, right? Somebody just asked me, who actually wrote the Bintel Brief? And, we understand from Abkan's memoir that he would like to take the credit for having, the founding editor, for having answered a lot of those letters, Leon Gottlieb. But like Beth is going to tell you shortly, it was sort of a circulating, almost a collective response. And, different people who had time, I would imagine, in their day, were tasked with answering the letters. And at some point, Abkan writes about, there was a pretty well-known activist, I think a biography just came out about her, Rose Pastor Stokes. She was invited by Kahn specially to answer. That's one of the few women that I know answered the Bintel Briefs. A Yiddish writer named Mendel Osherovitz, some of you may know because he broke the story of the famine in Ukraine. He's really known for that. But he was also a Yiddish novelist. If you've ever seen the Yiddish film A Brivele der Mamen, he wrote the script. We know it as one of the few instances where the Forward building was actually included in a film. He wrote the screenplay for that. And you can imagine, it's a letter to mother. You can imagine that he riffed on the letters he was seeing come into the office. And of course, as I said, Isaac Metzger. Isaac Metzger was also a well-known novelist. He did the longest stretch of Bintel duty. He published those 2 volumes that are available in English. And interestingly enough, he then, in the 1940s, became tasked with another long-running feature of the Forward called Seeking Relatives, right? Some of you may know that, people write to me all the time and say, my family came to America because somebody in America saw that we had survived the war, right, especially after the Holocaust. And so they were able to send us a visa. So these were announcements that we placed in the paper of people seeking their relatives, and Isaac Metzger was tasked with that. So it's interesting to sort of see the arc between him answering people's letters and then all the way into the 40s when people were looking for relatives. And the Bintel Brief was also involved in family reunification. So a lot of the letters that we received in the early years, and especially leading up to the war, were people who had lost contact with their relatives. And so they would come and they would place a Bintel Brief letter, and they would come to the Forward office. So it's interesting to see those 2 connections. In the 1930s in America, when we were talking here about juvenile delinquency, a book was published called The Unadjusted Girl. And when they came to talking about delinquency among Jewish immigrant young women, they turned to the Bintel Brief. So the Bintel Brief has been used as like primary source material for understanding immigrants' lives. The several PhDs have looked to the Bintel Brief. It's not unusual. If you do a search, you'll find theses on the Bintel Brief. And there was so much input and people coming into the building that 2 individuals were tasked with the job, 2 editorial assistants were tasked with the job of manning that desk. We know that one man's name was Daniel Feder and another was Yiska Frankel. And of course, a lot of you probably know this, the Bintel Brief as a small enterprise. Writing Bintel Brief letters became a Lower East Side kind of business for people, helping people who couldn't write in Yiddish to formulate their letters. So, just to go back to the building, by 1912 we had our own building, right? It's not our building that we use, but it's a historic landmark on the East Broadway. You can go see it still. But back in the day, it had a 30,000 watt neon sign on top. On one side reading in English, Jewish Daily Forwards, and on the other side in Yiddish. And the joke is that if you were coming over the Manhattan Bridge, you're coming from the west, you would see the English. If you're coming over the Williamsburg Bridge, you saw the Yiddish. So, you can imagine. So, again, in an anniversary issue, this is how they describe the Forward building itself and the effect it had. Why were people coming to the Forward? I wouldn't go to the New York Times and just So this is what they said about how they perceived. You can connect with the entire world through the Forward's building, not to mention how while you're there, you are located in the epicenter of the hubbub of Jewish life. In the Forward's elevator, you'll meet the most important individuals who play a critical role. She's an institution in the fullest sense of the term, meaning she's become an organic part of the life of the Jewish people. It's hard to imagine the East Side without the Forwards. It would be like, let's say, Washington without the President's White House, or London without the Parliament. The lobby also serves simultaneously as a debating arena where one continues what wasn't concluded in the subway or in the office you just exited. So, okay, that's them talking about themselves, so, but still, the first letter that arrived in 1906 that they sought to publish was from a woman living on Eldridge Street who wanted to use the Forwards in order to appeal to her neighbor to return a watch. Yeah, okay, but it gets better. Once, when she had to go out, this is Khan repeating the letter. Once, when she had to go out, the neighbor agreed to keep an eye on her house. When she returned home, she noticed that the watch was missing. It soon became apparent to her that it was in a pawn shop. She didn't think her neighbor was a thief, but she suspected the neighbor of pawning the watch since her husband was out of work. In her letter to the Forwards, the woman wrote that she understood her neighbor's situation and felt her pain, but she feared her husband would also lose his job, and she too would have to frequent the pawn shop. Also, if her neighbor would give her the pawn ticket for the item placed in the pawn shop, she'd pretend nothing had happened. Her neighbor could leave the ticket, come over for a visit, leave the ticket anywhere you want. I'll find it, not a problem. So she wrote to the Forwards in order to talk to her neighbor without causing discomfort. In her letter, she invited the neighbor to come over again, assuring her that she was always a welcome guest. And this is Khan talking about why that letter was the letter. I was happy about this letter that reflected a worker's life better than any story the talented literati could create. It was an outstanding example showing readers about our intent. So, moving a little bit forward, in 1922, here's one that I think relates to, we just published one, right, about two sisters squabbling? So,
we've had several about two sisters.
Right. So, right, and so back in 1922, similarly, we had what we call the Montreal Sisters. And it just kind of reflects also the Bintel's work in, what we call family reunification, but also, families tearing apart. I know when the pandemic started, we got a lot of letters about people who were having difficulty, en famille, among the family, Vaccination became an issue. Pods were, there were a lot of issues. So here we are in 1922. And here's what the writer wrote from Montreal. A year and a half ago, when it was possible to emigrate from Poland, I received the first letter from my sister stating that she's practically barefoot, naked, and starving. She asked me to bring her and her partner over here. Upon receiving such a letter, I immediately sent them a ship's ticket and enough money for their expenses. For 6 whole months, they lived with us in our home and didn't spend a cent. After 6 months, they paid a third of the expenses, according to what they could have paid had they been boarding with strangers. That's how I treated my sister and brother-in-law. Now I want to convey how they acted towards me. They lied to me, worse than if they had been strangers. Once, I was ill and bedridden for 2 days. I have a 1.5-year-old child, and my sister wouldn't watch him. She didn't even offer to get the kid a glass of milk. The child was so upset the whole time until finally he fell asleep on the floor. My husband works in a shop all day long, so I was forced to drag myself out of bed and lift the child off the floor and put him to bed. When I felt better, I asked my sister if she thought she was treating me right, to which she replied, "How dare you? I didn't come here to serve you." Ooh. Over time, things changed. My husband was unemployed for 3 months, and we experienced some difficulties. It wasn't our best time. I asked if she could start contributing to make up for what I'd been spending on them. No. We fought, and they moved out. So I ask you, respected editor, must I make amends with this kind of a sister? Can I even have anything good to say about her? Thank you in advance. I remain your Montreal reader. And here's the forward's response. Living together causes friction. We don't see that she's done anything terrible to you. Neither of you can claim you're of the best sister stock. You're both wrong. You've done more good for each other than bad. Sisters will have words. Surely now that you live separately, you wish only the best for each other. Stop your petty squabbling. It's unsuitable, not a good look. Your children will suffer from it. They'll also learn to quarrel and fight because that's how their mothers behave. And should your children go around bickering over nothing, you'll know how horrible and bitter it is to argue. Okay, so moving ahead. The general sense that most of us have, I think, is that the Bintel Brief provided a dose of communal guidance on Jewish social issues such as intercultural marriages, problems with paying the rent, eviction, landlords, philosophical differences in relationships, political and religious ones, families lost due to war and immigration. But jumping ahead a little bit, past into the 60s, right past the Summer of Love, we were delighted and a little bit taken aback by a 1969 letter we received about the problems of, are you ready? Bingo. I don't know if you remember, like in the 60s and 70s, right, there were a lot of fundraisers, like bingo halls became popular. Anyways, a Leser schreibt wegen die Freuen, was verschwenden Zeiten Geld beim Spielen Bingo. A reader writes in about women wasting time and money playing bingo. So this is from a man who thinks he found the solution. His wife is just compelled every night going out playing bingo. And not only is he afraid that she's becoming a gambleaholic, he's also like, what's the deal? I'm sitting here. It's like, how do I make a date night? I can't get my wife to stay home. What do I do? So here he writes, this went on for some time. So I talked to my wife and I tried to convince her that she was ruining herself and me along with her. I begged her to stop playing and stop attending the games that seemed like going to a lunatic asylum. There was such, he went out and he followed her to see, what's the deal? Why is she? There was such madness there and such a tumult in that smoke-filled hall. You remember that when you could smoke? Smoke-filled hall, you could choke. There's the waiting the whole night for the right number to be called, and then the disappointment when you lose, and those couple of dollars lost as well add up when you're playing nightly. No good could come of this. My wife listened to what I was saying and replied that I was actually right, and she kept on playing bingo. But in time, I came up with a plan. So his big plan, which the forward supported, because as you'll see, the forward is, I think most advice columns in newspapers, correct me, you can let us know later, but that they kind of wanted to create a loop with the reader, right? Their goal in some sense, yes, of course, was public service journalism, right, to help, but it was also, let's keep everybody reading the paper, right? And especially in the early years, in 1906 when they started, it would be hard to not believe that the Bintel had a lot to do with the growth, right, of the paper. The circulation of the paper grew from 1906 to in the 1910s, it was at 100,000, and by the mid-20s, it was at 250,000. It was at 250,000. That was our peak. So you have to think that the Bintel had something to do with this. So they're looking to do that. When they answer, they're also looking to sort of support the forward reader. So this is okay. Thank you. I have 5 minutes. Okay, so this is one of those cases when he decides, in the evening after he finishes dinner, he pulls out the forward and he starts to read aloud. And I have heard from many people that was a thing that people did in their homes. A lot of times, the forward was read to the family. One people would be the reader. I know early in time, back in some of the cigar rolling factories, because it was sort of work where people sat at a table and rolled, they would have a reader read the paper to people while they were working. So those are examples of the paper being read out loud. And I know also, just anecdotally, Yiddish Forward editors, when they want to talk about circulation, they say "Maburgt die Zeitung." The paper gets passed from person to person, so they would add in like 10,000 to the circulation just for the paper being borrowed. So, this gentleman, just to go back to him, decides he's going to read the paper out loud at night, and it doesn't work for the first night, but by the second night, the wife is kind of starting to stay home, and by the third and fourth night, apparently she's bringing people back from the bingo hall to come and hear the paper being read, and then he moves on to Yiddish literature. So the forward was like, what a great idea. We've received a few calls about this letter with complaints about, wives going out and not staying home at night. They're going to the bingo. And so, in part, they say, it's the men's fault. Like, why are they going out? They've quickly let on how this resembles a gambling addiction. That's how far it's gone. We think the men can and must do something about it. With patience and tact, you can show there's a way to lose the influence of this habit on the women, and we doubt there's a man out there who isn't a bit jealous of how you found the way to excite your wife with a more pleasant and better way to use your free time. So I'm just going to end by also saying that it wasn't unusual for the forward, if there was an issue in the Bintel Brief that they thought was of major concern to the readership, they would flip it to a front page article. And one example from that is actually also in 1906, and it has to do with human trafficking, especially the trafficking of women. So that was also material that found its way into the Bintel Brief. And I'm just going to end by talking a little bit about some of the iterations of the Bintel Brief. Maybe some of you have seen Liana Fink, the graphic novelist, did a whole work on the Bintel and Obcon, the different editions that have been translated. Montreal Yiddish Theater, Dora Wasserman, famous Yiddish theater director. In the 1970s, I think she created the first play based on the Bintel Brief. And of course, like I said, many educators and Yiddish groups, and all of you love to read the Bintel Brief. So before I pass the mic on to Beth, I wanted to just offer an audio clip. In 1966, the Jewish Museum of New York had an exhibition on American Jewish history. Maybe some of you were there. And as part of it, they invited different actors to read Bintels. So what we're going to hear now is a 1966, a clip of Zero Must Tell, and it really gives you the energy of what it must have been like to be a new immigrant here and seeking help. So let's play that clip.
Dated February 27, 1906. Mein teurer Redakteur von Vorwärts. Ich lese jeden Tag mit größter Aufmerksamkeit die Zures von Familienleben in our Bintel Brief. Dear Mr. Editor of the Forward, I read the troubles of family life in your Bintel Brief each day very attentively, but my own troubles are so great, so enormous, that I will not even ask your permission to print my few words in your paper as others do, but simply I ask you right on the spot, help!
Okay, thank you, Chana, for that excellent look at Bintel from yesteryear. I'm going to add just a couple things, then I'll bring you into the present day. Chana alluded to the fact there are two published collections of Bintel letters. You can get them online. One's from the early 20th century, one's from the post-war era. I read through them when I took over managing the column last fall, and the difference in the volumes is so interesting, really reflects the assimilation of Jewish immigrants and probably in a lot of your families. The first volume is early 20th century, newly arrived Jews. They're often desperate, destitute, a mother with 6 kids, abandoned by her husband, factory workers locked on the factory floor, 18, 20 hours a day, abused by their bosses. There was even a letter from a group of immigrants who were being detained at Ellis Island in isolation for months, and they're asking for help. The Bintel was actually, the point of having these letters published in the foreword was for the foreword to help its readers navigate What services are available to you? What are your rights in America? What are the social mores of this new world? It was so interesting to look at the second volume, which was post-war. Here we've moved into, the middle class. The letters were things like, my wife died, I remarried, my children hate my new wife, what do I do? Or, I sent my daughter to college, I thought I was doing the right thing, and now she wants a job instead of staying home with the children, what do I do? Or, my son married a shiksa, what do I do? And interestingly, on a more serious note, there were letters about life after the Holocaust, and similar to the Montreal Sisters, there were a lot of issues about gratitude and what did these people owe me. You could not come to America as a Holocaust survivor unless you had a relative sponsoring you. The ones who did not have somebody here mostly went to Israel. And there were letters from Americans saying, I brought my cousins over, after the war from Poland or wherever they survived, and, they've been living in my house, and, they need to get a job, or from the other side, my uncle brought me over, and it was terrible during the war. I managed to survive, and now I'm here, and they don't give me a thing. They don't help me in any way. So, it's interesting. I think we have a different attitude toward the trauma that was experienced by people who survived the Holocaust, from this distance. In that moment, the forward response, very much the way I've read what it was like for survivors in Israel, put the past behind you, one foot in front of the other. That was yesterday, this is today, look at the future, just, work hard, do the right thing, it's all gonna be okay, forget all the terrible stuff, just move ahead. Not a lot of empathy or, oh, you poor thing, what you've been through is unbelievable, right? Not a lot of compassion, just a lot of get with the program. By the way, I am told that occasionally the editors of the foreword would make up questions for Bintel in order to get across a point they wanted to make to their readers. I have no independent confirmation of this. I can assure you we would never do a thing like that today. Which brings me to today. So I started managing the column in October. We are getting terrific response from readers. Our letters are often among the best read features on the website. A Bintel letter that we published last month was our most read story for the month of April out of something like 300 stories that we published. So that was super gratifying to know that readers really care about, what we're doing today, and also our response. That particular letter was really interesting. It was from a woman who converted, and then she married a Jewish man, and then they divorced. And the husband said, you're not Jewish anymore. You converted only to marry me, and now we're divorced, and you can't be Jewish. And she wrote to us, I loved my conversion. I found a welcoming shul near my home, but I feel intimidated attending services, and I don't know how to integrate into the community without retelling a painful story from my past. I'm at sea. And the way we do the Bintel column nowadays is, kind of use the word collective. There's a handful of us, and we kind of look at the letters that come in, and somebody who's interested in that topic or has some experience or expertise in it will answer it. My colleague Mira Fox wrote a beautiful, loving, supportive, and very halakhically knowledgeable answer to this convert. She said, we are commanded to love converts as Jews. Even reminding a convert that they were not Jewish is forbidden. Rabbis argue that converts were in fact always Jewish before they went through the ritual process. The Talmud never refers to converts as Gentiles, but always just as converts, as though they were converted even before they performed the ritual, as though their soul was always Jewish. And she went on. But the most amazing thing about this question and answer, we got hundreds and hundreds of people commenting on social media, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Reddit, and also letters to the editor. People just opened their hearts to this woman. They were like, come to Detroit, I'll take you to my shul. Do you live in LA? I'll go to synagogue with you. I'm in New Jersey, call me up. Just people saying how dare your husband, your ex-husband treat you this way, like you're one of us now. And the other funny thing was they quoted from The Big Lebowski, because the protagonist in that also was converted to marry, divorced, and remained Jewish, and they were just quoting on Twitter, all these snatches of dialogue. And they did where did I put it? They also wrote this funny thing to the Jet song from West Side Story on Reddit. When you're a Jew all the way, from your first challah bread to your last dying day. So you know, it's great to see that readers are still really into Bintel. Another thing we can do at Bintel is we can get an expert on behalf of a reader. For example, we had a new mother. She keeps kosher. She was introducing foods to her baby. You know, now they say give them a little peanut butter, give them an egg slowly a little bit, and just see if they can tolerate it. And she wondered, should I break my kosher kitchen to give my baby a taste of shrimp in case I can, you know, ward off a shellfish allergy? I didn't know the answer, but I called it Mount Sinai, and they got me the top pediatric allergist in New York to answer the question. In case you're wondering, the answer is no. There's no point in giving the baby shrimp if it's not going to be a regular part of their diet. But the point is, you know, we do have people who ask us questions that are like, they're not like just emotional family questions. They might be a logistical thing. And, you know, because we're the forward, we can call up some expert somewhere and get a legit answer. Okay, so let's see, was there anything else I wanted to say? I guess one other thing, again, building on something that Chana said, I got an email from a friend, actually. She said her daughter at the University of Pittsburgh was studying Bintel as part of a Jewish studies course. So, in fact, people do look to these old columns, you know, to learn about the sociology and the milieu of what was life like for those early 20th century immigrants. Okay. So here's the fun part of the program. I brought 2 letters that we have not yet answered, and I thought that I would read them aloud to you guys and see if you can help me, give me some ideas for how you would answer them. Okay, I'm going to read, they're both pretty short, so I'm going to read them both, and then Gabriel, are you out there? I can't see anything. Maybe Gabriel you guys can raise hands, and if people have, you know, thoughts. Okay, the first one is called Crushing the Rabbi. I'm a single woman, and one of the rabbis at my shul is a single man. We are both straight and close in age. Sometimes our dynamic feels more like friends than rabbi-congregant, with jokes, casual repartee, and discovering much that we have in common. I find that I'm developing romantic feelings for him. Given that we are both available, is there any scenario in which we could pursue a personal relationship? I want to underscore that I'm coming to this on my own and don't feel coerced or pressured in any way. Okay, so we got the Me Too thing is not an issue here, right? Okay, I'm going to read you the other one, which is a much, I think, more serious one, and, you know, I think they're both pretty interesting. My family and I moved to the Bible Belt because of my spouse's job. Our daughter, who is in elementary school, has faced severe bullying, including anti-Semitism. I've complained for the whole school year due to the nature of the bullying being physical, and to the point where my daughter is traumatized. How do you deal with this? By the way, at our local shul, we aren't the only family in this school district to face anti-Semitism when it comes to our children. So I don't know, let's see. Gabriel, should I sit? Should I stand? What should I? Okay, yeah. I'll go to the living room. So anybody have any advice for crushing on the rabbi or the mom with the bullying situation? And if not, I'm going to turn to Chana and see if she can help me. Anybody else?
Yeah, we have back here.
Okay.
We brought in support from the office.
I don't want to spoil this show, but you should advise her to watch Fleabag.
You should what? Oh, advise her to watch Fleabag. Oh, yes. Okay. You're talking about crushing the rabbi. Yes, okay, cool. All right, cool. What do you think, honey? What would you say to either or both of them?
Oh, wow. Well, seeing as I am from 1906, I got very strict in my head. I heard a very strict rabbinic voice for the rabbi that said, one of you has to leave the shul, and if you're still interested in each other, then you can pursue something. But it's, I don't know.
You just mean physically. This is
Like she has to stop being a member, or he has to leave.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's like therapist.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
boy.
He has to provide for that.
Uh-oh.
I don't know.
Do I have any
So
HR
I said it was
professionals
strict,
in the
and it
house?
was very, very 1906.
Okay, wow.
And yeah, there's a hand. I think this gentleman.
Yeah,
There's
good.
a woman.
I have a suggestion about the bullying.
Yeah.
And I had faced a little of that when my son was bullied in school. And what I did was I marched up to the principal's office an hour before school started, and I told the principal that if somebody lays a hand on my son, I'm going to hold her personally responsible. And I scared the shit out of them, and they left. You know, anytime any kid looked crooked at my son, they removed the kid. So my advice is to march up to the principal's office. Now, this is the Bible Belt. Maybe I'd get a bulldog Jewish lawyer to march in with me.
I think we have a few in the audience.
Yeah, and make it really clear that that's unacceptable, and there'll be consequences if it continues.
Yeah. And you?
Oh, I wish I could stay on the funny part of it, but okay, you asked a serious question, I'll give you a serious answer. I worked for Anti-Defamation League for a while, and they have a program called Confronting Anti-Semitism, where they specifically go into the schools. So I would have them, I know they're out in Yenamsveld.
You said the ADL, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But they would definitely have a chapter somewhere nearby, and they train people on how to deal with this and bring people into the school, and they would do all kinds of kind of acting out kinds of things of both parents and students, and they would go to the administration, and if they would have to, they would go to law enforcement.
Yeah, no, I like the idea of going to an outside organization that, you know, has people who are trained, who are neutral, who, you know, can be the advocate for the parent, you know, in that situation. And I relate to your story with your son. Years ago, there was a situation in our family, and I covered politics for the Associated Press earlier in my career, and I would read a lot of political memoirs, and one of the ones I liked the most, actually, though I didn't particularly like the politician, was Alphonse D'Amato, the senator from Long Island. He wrote a great memoir, and he had a whole thing about when he was a kid being bullied in the schoolyard, and he said, a bully is a coward. If you stand up to a bully, they'll back off. And so I had a baby in a stroller, and I chased this bully down in a bodega, and I caught him in one of the narrow aisles with my baby in the stroller, and I threatened him with an inch of his life, and I said, if you ever come near that kid again, I'm going to tell your mother, and then I'm going to tell the principal, and then I'm going to make you wish you were never born. And that was the end of that bully. But I think you probably, I mean, this was a long time ago. This was 25 years ago. I think you probably couldn't get away with it today, because I think probably, you know, you would get like a lawsuit, you might get shot, you know, I don't know. This is not useful information anymore, but it is how we dealt with it back in the day. What
But can I add to that too? Because what I heard too, like a little bit between the lines, right? It was an interesting, like your ADL mention is very important here, because Bible Belt,
right,
anti-Semitic, like that is a lot for one family to handle. And what I kind of heard a little bit, like what's in our sort of our archival history is organizing, right? So like that you're not alone, and that getting everyone else together and maybe bringing in a program.
Yeah, they call themselves 911 for anti-Semitism.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. The other thing I was struck by in that letter is she says, we're not, you know, I guess there must be a small Jewish community there, because she says we're not the only family in the shul who's had to do this. And I'm sort of like, where is the rabbi? Like maybe the parents haven't thought to go to him or her. But I, you know, as I'm sort of thinking all this through in my head, like what am I going to say to this parent? You know, I was also thinking like, you know, I think you should get together with the other parents. You should make a meeting with the rabbi. And maybe the rabbi may even be in a position where maybe they could even do like an interfaith, you know, if the rabbi has a good relation with, say, a pastor, and maybe they could go to the principal together and say, you know, because I'm guessing if there's anti-Semitism in the school, if there's bullying in the school, there may be other things going on that have to do with hatred and, you know, being mean and hurt, you know, things that are painful for kids that are different in all kinds of ways. And, you know, as we know, because there are stories about this in the news all the time, schools don't often have a good way of responding. But, you know, like you say, I'm going to get in touch with the ADL. If they have programs that maybe they can offer a curriculum or someone to come in and, do some work.
He's talking about violence, but even if it's ethnic jokes, sometimes kids don't know what they're saying.
Right.
So education has to be in there. Or graffiti, let's say.
Right.
Your first inclination is, you want to march off the swastika. That's not what you're supposed to do. You have to wait until there are photographs being taken, because now it's a hate crime.
Right.
Which ADL started also.
Right.
So sometimes our first impulse is not the right thing to do.
Right.
And they teach you all that.
Right, right. And how about the other one with the rabbi crush? Do you think that they need to leave the synagogue?
I didn't say both of them. I said
one of them. Okay. You're shaking your head no. What do you think?
Oh,
Oh, sure.
I had one over here, if that's okay. So I had more to the first question, actually. I was thinking about this. And so from my perspective, the best way to go about this, in theory, because it is a sensitive situation, you have a rabbi who, even if you kind of take out the power dynamic, from the rabbi's perspective, he has to be a kind of charismatic, friendly figure to most of his congregation, I imagine. And that is not only uncomfortable for the letter writer, but the rabbi himself. And so some people might think you should take a kind of direct approach about this, but my automatic go-to would be that maybe there's a married shadchan in the community, or a matchmaker, or just a married friend who might be able to gauge in a non-threatening way or a non-uncomfortable way from the rabbi, is this someone that you might have a potential relationship with, or is this just kind of you are friendly with your congregants and don't want to have any kind of negative feelings between the two of you? I think there's also a new Netflix show. I don't know what Fleabag is, but I think there is a new matchmaking show, I think, about Jewish matchmaking.
Yeah, there is a Jewish matchmaking. That's a great answer. I'm totally stealing that. Thank you. And I saw you were, this lady in the third row here, you were...
I just don't think either of them have to be good community. I think that's a good suggestion, to get some third party.
Yeah, yeah, I like it. He said maybe a priest can fix them up. Yeah. So I don't know, and I don't know if anybody here has something that they want to ask us that we could try to answer on the fly, or have anybody in the audience answer on the fly. I, of course, relate to the feuding sisters. Love my sister, but in the summer we share a very small house, and she has a lot of rules, and I break them all the time, and we do sometimes butt heads. It's hard. Yeah, and we've had several feuding sister letters. One just this past week. This was really a heavy one. This woman is an Israeli citizen. Her sister is pro-BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement against Israel. So she sat Shiva for her living sister. And she wants to know, should we reconcile? I mean, okay, wow. And we actually, in the course of researching this with a couple of rabbis, one of my colleagues, Nora Berman, learned something interesting. So I don't know if you remember from Fiddler on the Roof, he sits Shiva for his daughter when she marries a non-Jew. Okay, according to the rabbis that helped us answer this question, there's no such thing as sitting Shiva for a living person no matter what they do. It's just not even, like, you could do it, but it's totally meaningless. So, I mean, part of this woman's letter was like, I already sat Shiva for her, so how could I reconcile with her now that I already said she's dead to me? And so we were at least able to say, well, technically, halachically, she's not dead to you. Not only is she actually alive, but what you did was meaningless in religious terms. But then, of course, there was the whole other thing of, can you put aside politics on Israel and, have sisterly love, without that being part of your ongoing relationship. So, I don't know. Anybody else, or? Yeah. What?
Very simply, you just answered the question that you asked. It sounds very simple. Maybe it isn't as simple as I could present it, but you just agree not to discuss issues that are contentious. It shouldn't be that difficult. And if it comes up again,
Is it difficult to not discuss issues that you
No.
disagree on?
but you can't sit shiver more than once, I don't think, for the same person.
I love that energy,
But it
though,
sounds
that
like a simple
answer.
solution.
Yes, no, it is a simple solution if you can abide by it, for sure. And I mean, politics, we all know from the last, 8 years or so, a lot of American families have been riven by politics as well. Not Israel necessarily, but, the divide over Trump and lots of other things that have come up. Vaccinations that you mentioned. We did get a lot of pandemic letters. We're still getting letters about the pandemic.
But I want to just address like the energy coming off that answer, which I totally relate to, which is like, does that happen to you? Like you're being the Eitzegeber, you're the advisor in chief, and like you read a long letter, which happened to them, right? Like back in the day, like sometimes their answer was 2 sentences. They're like, get a grip, right? So like, does that happen? And what do you do? Like you don't want to make the person feel bad, right? But you're like, no.
Well, I mean, we do have a team of editors, and so I don't think we're, I think when an answer is too short, there's an editor who's like, I think we need a little bit more here. So, we want to make it an interesting read. It's interesting, though, because I read a lot of advice columns. In fact, being connected to an advice column was something I always kind of wanted to do. And I'm sure, there's probably a lot of people here who read like Social Cues and The Ethicist. So The Ethicist tends to write these kind of long, considered, philosophical treatises. The Social Cues guy, Philip Galanis, I think is his name, he is very much like, nope, you're wrong. Just don't say that anymore, and next. And I'm always amazed in in the space of 1,000 words, he'll answer 4 questions just by these very cut and dried answers, I think we try to be a little more Talmudic, right, than that. Yeah. And actually this reminds me, one other thing, just building on what you said earlier, we also got a letter recently from someone who remembered and described for us that scenario of Bintel being read aloud in their home. She said that her grandmother in Philadelphia was raising a bunch of kids on her own, and the neighbor next door was also raising a bunch of kids on her own. And she said at the end of a long day, they both worked outside the home, and then they would make dinner for all these kids. She said at the end of a long day, they would sit on the porch, and they would read Bintel. And then, just as we're doing now, they would talk about, well, what do you think? What would you have said? What would you do? So it also became a way for people to come together. And when we have a letter like the one from the convert who got divorced, and I go through and I'll read like 125 comments on Instagram, I feel like we are creating that same community in the virtual world. Maybe people aren't sitting on their porches anymore going back and forth, but they are still saying, oh yeah, I totally support this person, and here's what I would do, and they send their love. I mean, it's pretty heartwarming, actually. And I've been surprised also at how rarely we have a response from what I would call a troll. Very rarely do we get a comment on social media that's just kind of mean-spirited, which is nice.
That sounds really interesting, too, to think about trolling an advice column. Like,
yeah,
you're wrong. Like, what would it be?
I'm sort of addicted to, like, the Times social cues, and they will get, like, hundreds of answers from people, sometimes disagreeing, but anyway.
That sounds like in the cooking column, how people change the recipe.
The recipe, right, yes. You put in too much curry. Well, it is 4:30, and we don't want to hold you guys any more than we promised. Thank you so much for coming, and send us your questions. Bintel@forward.com. Thank you.